Hi everyone, we're really excited that you are here at this webinar today. This webinar is entitled Writing Better, How Can Teachers Use Data to Individualize Instruction in Writing? And it is going to be presented by Kristen McMaster and Lembke, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in just a minute. Nick, if you can flip over to the next slide. As Nick mentioned, this webinar is co-hosted by the National Center for Intensive Intervention here at American Institutes for Research and the Division for Research from the Council for Exceptional Children. And we're excited to partner together on this webinar to be able to share some information about writing with you all. For folks that are not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, if you have any questions throughout the webinar about content or any kind of questions about issues or technical issues or things like that, just let us know. You'll see a question pod in your control panel that allows you to type a question in, and we'll do our best to respond. Those questions for the presenters we'll go ahead and hold to the end or to a time that's appropriate in the presentation, and they will allow them to answer those questions at that time. Any questions that are technical questions, we'll go ahead and answer as soon as we can, as best as we can. As Nick mentioned as well, the handouts and the slides for the presentation are in your handout section, also of your control panel, and they can also be found along with the recording of this webinar on our NCII website. After the live event, we'll post everything up there, and I shared a link for that in the chat earlier. So you'll be able to see this webinar or share it with colleagues if they're not able to attend today as well. So go ahead to the next slide, Nick. So I'm really excited today because we have two really great presenters to share a little bit about the work that they've been doing within writing and research on writing instruction. First, we have Dr. Kristen McMaster, who is a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Minnesota. And then also we have Dr. Lembke, who is a professor and chair in the Department of Special Education at the University of Missouri. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them to start off the presentation.
Hi there, this is Erica, and I'll be starting out the presentation. So glad you could join us today. We're really excited about this work, and we're just so pleased to have so many of you joining us today as we talk a little bit more about our work in early writing assessment and intervention. I want to quickly acknowledge both of our research teams at Minnesota and Missouri. We certainly couldn't do this work without them, and also we've been very fortunate to receive a series of grants from the Institute on Education Sciences to support our work, and so thank you both to our teams and to IES for support of this work. The next one. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about sort of the background or theoretical underpinnings, if you will, of the work that we've been doing in early writing. It was really important to Kristen and I, both from a practical standpoint and of course from a research standpoint, to be thinking about how our work would fit together to support both students and teachers in the area of early writing. Our work really focuses on kids with those most intensive writing needs, and it's really three-pronged. We have assessments that help support teachers in knowing more about how their students are progressing and performing in early writing. That connects to instructional techniques or intervention techniques that we've developed then to support students who have those greatest needs or are most challenged in the area of early writing. And these two pieces in particular come together to form what we call the simple view of writing, and I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And then the third prong is really important to us and important to communicate to teachers. That's that database decision-making piece. So I've got all this data, but what do I do with it? And so we really work with our teachers and problem-solving teams to help them think through the data that they have and to help make better decisions about how their students are performing, but also about instructional changes that might be necessary. And so we have, when we support our teachers, both a process that we use to support them, and then we've developed materials that we use to support them as well. And Kristen and I will both be referring to some of those materials throughout the webinar today. So why writing? I think a lot of you who are on here know exactly why writing, because there just aren't as many resources and supports as we need in the area of writing. And certainly we know that writing is such a key facet of students' learning. We know that it contributes, of course, to more than just, writing a story. We know that writing development really contributes to students' overall literacy development, and we know that it's a really critical piece in helping support them to communicate later. We also know from longer-term studies that students who leave with greater writing prowess, greater writing support, are more successful in school, but also later in life. So all of these areas are really critical areas to support, and we know that when we can work hard on that early writing support early on, it can lead to much better outcomes. We know that also when we support children in early writing, that it can help improve the short-term outcomes. And so students who experience difficulty with writing can have great improvements made if we can really focus on early identification, instruction early on, and then that ongoing progress monitoring of the student's writing. Next one. And so as I mentioned before, this simple view of writing, which was really conceptualized by Virginia Berninger and her colleagues, it's been studied over time and somewhat modified, but this simple view of writing really creates sort of the backbone of our process in our work in early writing. The next one. And so we really conceptualize this simple view of writing as kind of a three-pronged approach, but also sort of constrained by or limited to some extent by attention and memory. And so I'll go through and talk about these components of the simple view of writing. I think that our teachers who have been involved in our work have really found this simple view to be a good way to think about how these writing pieces are connected to one another. And it really helps create this kind of nice visual and nice heuristic of how teachers might approach intervening and working with students in writing. Next one. So I'll start first with transcription. Transcription is sort of our lowest level writing area. This is includes things like handwriting, spelling. It could be, very basic sentence writing, but that transcription is kind of our earliest writing skill that we're teaching students. We know that some of our students who are our youngest students, but also some students who are older and just haven't mastered transcription yet, need that support in the area of transcription. So as we're thinking about an initial area to focus on, transcription is often like our first stop. If you haven't seen some of the work completed recently on the importance of handwriting and the long-term effects of poor handwriting, you really should look more at that work. In particular, Steve Graham, who'll be doing the second part of this webinar in a couple of weeks, has really been studying handwriting, and it's a really important area, but sometimes not as focused on anymore. The second area, if you go ahead, is text generation. And at this level, we have students who are now turning these words, these basic sentences into paragraphs. They're generating content. They're developing some stories. So this text generation is kind of the second critical piece. Some of our students are past the transcription phase, but they need additional work at the text generation level. And so as you're listening today, and if you're in a classroom, you might be thinking about a student that you currently have or students, and where the focus might be for those particular students. Would it be at the transcription level or the text generation level? The third key component of the simple view of writing is this self-regulation piece. And self-regulation is really critical for a lot of subject matter, but in particular really critical for this early writing piece. So these are writing processes like self-monitoring, setting goals for yourself, self-evaluating. Again, there are some really great pieces out there on self-regulated strategy development, or SRSD. Steve Graham, Karen Harris, Linda Mason, and their colleagues have done a lot of work to develop and support self-regulated strategy development. And so we really rely on that in the area of writing as a critical and evidence-based practice to address that self-regulatory piece. Next. And then we know that all of these, transcription, text generation, self-regulation, these pieces of the simple view are constrained by the amount of attention and memory that students bring to the table. For some of your students, maybe the student you're thinking about today, it may be that there are working memory, short-term or long-term memory issues. It could be that attention, lack of focus is an area that is a need for your particular student. And so we think about how those critical areas, kind of those executive functioning pieces, how they might impact the work we do in these three areas of the simple view. And I think you'll see that as we start to share some of our assessments and intervention material. Next one. Okay, great. Thank you. So as we developed our materials, and as I mentioned from the outset, this work has primarily been occurring as part of first a development grant from the Institute on Education Sciences, and now a Goal 3, or sort of an efficacy project where we'll be testing this on a much broader scale. But we've worked with teachers and their students to help develop assessment and intervention materials along with database decision-making materials that might meet their needs for some of their students who have those intensive writing needs. At the assessment level, we really aligned our assessments with the areas of the simple view. And our assessments for this project are really aligned with what we know about curriculum-based measurement, or CBM materials. You'll see here as an example, this is our word level, or one of our transcription level tasks. This is word dictation. Teachers read the words to students. Students write down the words they hear. Each word is dictated twice. It's sort of like a spelling test, but these were created being very specific about the words that we chose. In fact, the words in the word list align to certain word types or word patterns, so that a teacher could go back and actually do some type of item analysis to see the types of words that students are missing. So word dictation is a 3-minute task that's administered to students. This task is individually administered and really captures that transcription level progress monitoring, or transcription level performance by the child. I know that when Kristen and I first began studying early writing measures, CBM measures, both of us, along with a handful of other researchers in the field, were really interested in some of these measures that might capture student progress at some of those lowest levels of writing. And so we've felt good and been fortunate to be able to research these a bit more. And next one. And I'm sorry, this is an example of what one of those, a completed word dictation task might look like. This is actually one from one of our students, so it might look familiar. Next one. And then in a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about how these measures are scored, because it might be a little unique from what you are used to. This is an example of a measure that could be used to capture transcription progress or text generation level progress. This is a measure, again, 3 minutes. This can be administered to a group if you'd like. There is a picture and a word represented. You go through and the administrator reads the pictures, the words underneath each picture and shows them, and then the students are asked to write sentences for each picture and word for 3 minutes. They write as much as they can during that time. You might go ahead to the next one. And then finally, this is an example of a measure that captures mainly passage level or text generation progress for students. This is one, if you're familiar with progress monitoring in writing using CDM, this was probably the measure that's most familiar to you. This is a story prompt measure. Story starter is provided for the students, and they're given a few seconds to think and then 3 minutes to write the story. And again, I'll show you in just a minute how these are scored. Next. And so while we don't have particular measure of self-regulation, there are measures or rubrics, self-assessments of self-regulation in some of those SRSD, self-regulated strategy development materials that I talked about earlier. Each of the tasks that we're using is designed to support self-regulation. So we look through, we think about the different tasks that students are completing, and then a teacher and a student might set those goals or might self-monitor the particular progress that the student is making on each of these tasks. Next. So when we score each of these measures, the scoring is a little unique from something you might have seen before. And I'm going to give you kind of a quick overview of scoring. If you're interested in what that scoring might look like in a more detailed fashion, we do have some scoring videos posted on each of our websites. Later on in the webinar, Kristen's going to talk a little bit about our websites, and so it might be helpful for you to see the scoring videos to learn a little bit more. We score typically, and these are accepted and research-based CDM scoring methods for early writing. We score typically using things like words written, words spelled correctly, correct letter sequences for word dictation, or correct word sequences for the picture, word, or story prompts. Again, as you look at and think about your particular student, you would pick the scoring technique that you feel like best matches the information you're trying to capture. So if I was just starting with a student and I'm just trying to build his fluency in writing, perhaps build his stamina in writing, I might start out and just monitor words written. However, after the student gets going, I'm not going to want to only monitor words written. I really need to know, is that student spelling words correctly? I'll talk a little bit about word sequences in a second, which takes into account grammar, syntax. So you can see as you start from the top with words written and move your way down to the sequences, you get increasingly more specific information about the student's writing. Next one. So just to give you a sense of how these would be scored, for picture word as an example, and you saw an example of one of those earlier, the example I showed you earlier actually was just a single page from picture word. We actually have, I think, about 6 pages of pictures and words that a student could go through during that 3 minutes. You first would read all of the sentences that the student wrote. You would count the number of words written, underline in red incorrectly spelled words, and then if you were going on and you were going to score more specifically, if you were going to score correct word sequences, for instance, you would mark the beginning or end of each sentence if the student didn't already have those marks, correct punctuation marks in, and then you would use a caret method to mark the correct and incorrect sequences. And you're going to see an example of this caret method in just a second. Go ahead. So let's talk a little bit more about picture word scoring. So words written, as I mentioned before, that would be sort of the most, the least complicated, but also perhaps the least information for you in terms of how your student is performing on a particular task. And so in picture word, a word would be defined as a sequence of letters separated by a space from another sequence. So we wouldn't take into account capitalization, punctuation. This is just a word is a word, and we count that sequence of letters as a word. So the number that you would tally, the number that you would graph in a CBM type technique would be simply the number of words written on that particular picture word task. Remember, again, that's the full 3-minute task. Next. Okay, next, thank you. So another way that you could go through and score would be looking at words spelled correctly. Now, this is just as a spell checker would check that. So you can see below the example, it doesn't matter if it's used correctly when we score using words spelled correctly. It simply matters if it is a correctly spelled word. So below, the word bear should have been B-E-A-R, but B-A-R-E, bear, is also a correctly spelled word, so that would not be an error in this particular, using this particular scoring technique. Now, some of you may be saying, hey, wait, I want to count some of those things as errors. And next, when I talk about correct word sequences, that takes into account those spelling errors that a student might make. So far we've talked about words written, simply any word that's separated by some spaces, sequence of letters separated by spaces. We've talked about words spelled correctly, which is just sort of checking like a spell checker would. When we score using correct or incorrect word sequences, we're looking at any two adjacent words that are correct in terms of spelling, grammar, capitalization, punctuation. So this is where we're taking into account some of those more technical errors that a student might be making. And we score this using a caret method. Next. So this is an example of how we might score a sentence using correct word sequences. So first, we're going to read the sentence. The man saw a bear in the tree and began to run. Then we go through next, and we actually first highlight any words that are spelled incorrectly. In this case, in the entire sentence, began is the only word that's spelled incorrectly, so that's underlined. Then we go back through and we first put incorrect sequences in. So using a red pencil, we use that little under caret to highlight any sequence that's incorrect. So let's start at the beginning of the sentence. The to man, the man. So the is the start of a sentence. It's capitalized. The and man are both spelled correctly. So they get, so right now, if we're looking at incorrect sequences, there are no incorrect sequences so far. We don't actually get to an incorrect sequence until we get to a bear. Now we know this is not the right form of bear, and so that is an incorrect sequence between a and bear, an incorrect sequence between bear and in. We keep going through the sentence, and again, a word spelled incorrectly, began. So and to begin or began to, both of those are incorrect sequences. Once we have the incorrect sequences in, we can go back and we can put in our upper carets in blue. Those are our correct sequences. Start of the sentence to the word the, great job, they capitalized, that's correct sequence. The to man, man to saw to a, and so on. You can see that we've put those correct sequences in where the incorrect sequences were not. Finally, at the end of the sentence, run to the end of the sentence. We've got that good punctuation there, and so they get an upward caret, a correct word sequence from run to the end of the sentence. This would give this particular student 9 correct word sequences, 4 incorrect word sequences. The number that you could graph would be, you could graph both correct and incorrect, or just the correct. Next slide. So I've kind of gone through and talked a little bit about these critical pieces of the simple view of writing. I've exposed you just a little bit to the type of scoring that we do. And I'm going to, I just wanted to make one more comment, and then I'm going to hand it over to Kristen. And Kristen's actually going to kind of take you through these critical pieces in our database decision-making. But also, she's going to apply this to a case study, our case study of Molly. So if you're kind of thinking about how do all these pieces fit together, that I think should kind of bring it all together for you. Just briefly before I turn it over, and I did want to mention that in this particular case, we used picture word as an example of how you would score a measure. Only in the interest of time, we didn't go through all 3 measures: word dictation, picture word, story prompt. But we picked picture word because generally it incorporates most of the scoring methods that we utilize with these measures. So it gives you a good sense of what that would look like. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. Again, she's going to talk a little bit about our data-based instruction process and then move on to this case study.
All right. Well, thank you, Erica. You did a really great job of describing the simple view of writing and how that aligns with our early writing assessments. And as Erica just mentioned, I'll be now talking about how we bring our assessments together into a process of data-based instruction, or DBI. Now, some of you have probably heard of data-based instruction or data-based individualization if you've been involved with NCII. This process is not actually a new thing. It's been around for many decades in special education, both in research and in practice. And much of the work that's been done in data-based instruction has focused on reading and math and some work in spelling. And basically what Erica and I have done is apply this process to beginning writing. But I do want to emphasize that data-based instruction or data-based individualization is really a framework that can be applied across a lot of different content areas. It's a framework for database decision making, and we just happen to be using it for writing, but it can be used in a lot of different areas. So basically what we're doing is we're integrating assessment and instruction together into this database decision-making process. And Erica and I and our research teams have conceptualized DBI for beginning writers as an 8-step process, which will probably sound very familiar to you in general. So step 1 is we establish the present level of the student's writing performance. And then from there, we go to step 2 and set ambitious long-term goals. Step 3 is implementing high-quality instruction with fidelity. And then while we're doing that, we go on to step 4 and monitor progress toward the goal while instruction is taking place. For step 5, we use decision rules to evaluate the effectiveness of the instruction and the student's progress in the context of that instruction. And when we see that a student is not making sufficient progress, we go on to step 6, where we start to generate hypotheses about why that student might not be making the progress that we expected to meet their long-term goal. And we use those hypotheses to individualize instruction. Going on to step 7, we actually make an instructional change that goes along with our hypothesis. And then we repeat steps 4 through 7 as much as necessary until the child meets that long-term goal. Next, please. Next slide. So I will use a case example of Molly to describe this 8-step process. And Molly happens to be an 8-year-old student who is having difficulty with writing, and her teacher, Mr. O'Reilly, is going to use data-based instruction to help improve her writing. Next, please. So Mr. O'Reilly, Molly's teacher, starts by establishing Molly's current level of writing performance, or her baseline writing performance. So all of this is going to be depicted in a graph, so we get a really clear picture of how Molly is doing as her teacher, Mr. O'Reilly, engages in data-based instruction. So the first step is to choose, actually if we could stay on that slide, back to the graph, is to choose a CDM measure. So in this case, Mr. O'Reilly chooses picture word, which is the example that Erica shared. And he will actually administer 3 different prompts of that same picture word measure and use the median score of the 3 different prompts to get Molly's baseline data. In this case, Mr. O'Reilly uses correct word sequences to score Molly's picture word, and she gets 3 different scores on those 3 different prompts, 5, 7, and 4, and the median of those 3 scores is 5, so that's the score that gets plotted as this little red diamond on the baseline for the graph. Next slide. So here's an example of Molly's baseline performance. So again, this is our picture word measure, and she wrote 3 sentences. The mouse is squeaking, the sun is shining, and the can is mine. So she's responding to each of those pictures. And then you see the carrots that Erica was talking about that Mr. O'Reilly used to score incorrect and correct word sequences. Now, this is used for baseline. I'd also like you just to get a good look at this baseline prompt because we also get some really interesting and helpful qualitative information that might help in thinking through more about what Molly's strengths and needs are so that we can come up with a good instructional program for her. So you might notice here that her handwriting is pretty good, actually. She has a couple of spelling errors. She seems not to be capitalizing or punctuating her sentences. Her sentences are really relatively simple. So there's actually a lot of information that we can get even from this very brief writing sample that might be informative for thinking about instruction. Next slide. So the next step, now that we have the baseline, is to set an ambitious long-term goal. So this is where we would hope or expect Molly to be performing by the end of some instructional period. And in this case, we're using the school year. It could be an IEP cycle or a term, but we're choosing an instructional period and setting a long-term goal. Now that goal might be based on local benchmark data. So perhaps in 3rd grade, we expect students to be performing at about 35 correct word sequences by the end of the school year. I'm afraid my screen has just gone blank, so I will try to keep going with this and hope that it comes back. Actually, Erica, if you could jump in for a second, that would be helpful.
Yeah, of course. Yep. And so as Kristen just mentioned, and Kristen, just shout out if you want to jump back in, okay?
I will do that.
Good. Okay. So as Kristen just mentioned, we choose an ambitious long-term goal, and we do have those benchmark levels that we created. And actually, those are documented in other literature as well, a chapter from other researchers who have developed some of those goals. So Mr. O'Reilly sets this long-term goal. Next slide.
I can jump back in. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
All right, so now that we have baseline information and a long-range goal, and Mr. O'Reilly has drawn a line from baseline to goal to show the expected progress that we would like Molly to make, now it's time to implement high-quality instruction with fidelity based on the student's needs. So how do we go about deciding what type of instruction to implement? And that's where some more information might be helpful. So the CDM information, the quantitative score that we've talked about so far helps us know kind of the level at which the student is performing and the progress that she's making, but we might need more information in order to think about instruction. Next slide, please. So in the materials that we've developed for our teachers, which we will be sharing with you at the end in terms of how to access those, we do have some sort of diagnostic checklists that help the teacher think through what are the actual strengths and needs of the student in the different areas that we've talked about in relation to the simple view of writing. So if we think about one of the transcription skills, which is handwriting, if you think back to Molly's brief sample that I shared with you, there are a lot of things that we can actually say about her handwriting. It's generally in the correct direction. She uses smooth strokes. It's slanting in the right way. She uses spaces and so forth. But there might be some things that isn't clear. So she didn't write uppercase letters, so it's hard to know whether she does that legibly. We can probably guess, though, that she does. And so our overall conclusion might be that she generally has strengths in handwriting. Next slide, please. Then we might think about spelling, another important transcription skill. Now, from the sample that we have, we can glean some information, but there are some things that we just don't know, just based on the limitations of the sample. So we might see some areas where she has clear strengths, we might see some areas where she has clear needs, and we might have some questions where we might need a little bit more information, and that's where if you have spelling inventories that you're comfortable with or spelling measures from your curriculum or even going back to word dictation measures that Erica shared earlier, you can get more information about the student's spelling strengths and needs. So that's where maybe some additional information would be helpful. Next slide, please. We'd also want to look at her text generation. And from the sample that we have, we do have some information. Clearly, Molly is not punctuating and capitalizing. She is using some correct parts of sentences, but her sentences are very simple. We might want to collect some more information to get a better sense of whether she's using a variety of words and so forth. So maybe some basic analytic writing rubrics or just more samples of Molly's writing so we can get a better idea of her strengths and needs in terms of text generation. So we would gather that information as well. Next slide, please. And then after looking at all of the information, so including Molly's picture word samples, but also other information that we collect, then the teacher should have enough information to at least get started on an instructional program. And based on Molly's information, Mr. O'Reilly decides she does need some help in spelling words with long vowels and consonant blends. She needs some help with sentence construction, specifically using capital letters and punctuation. And she could use some work on sentence combining so that she starts to write more complex sentences. Next slide, please. So now on our graph, we have a vertical line indicating that intervention 1 has begun. And intervention 1 is basically going to comprise those 3 components that I just spoke about, having to do with spelling and text generation. And while that instruction is going on, Mr. O'Reilly is going to continue to collect picture word data, so administering 1 prompt each week, collecting data to show whether she's making progress in response to instruction. And we typically recommend collecting at least 8 data points before stopping to make a decision. 8 data points seems to be, from some of our research and that of others, to be the minimum number needed to get a reliable and stable slope of progress so that we can make a good decision. Also gives time for the intervention to work, but doesn't go for so long that we're allowing the student to fail when really we should be making an instructional decision. Next slide, please. And then once we have those 8 data points, we're going to use decision rules to decide whether the instruction is effective or we need to make some sort of instructional change. And so we work with our teachers to think through some different decision rules that we might make based on the trend line. So that's the line kind of showing the general direction that, of progress that a student is making. So the 3 different rules that we think about are, if the trend line is steeper than the goal line, so the student is making more progress than expected, we would increase the goal because we always want to have high, ambitious expectations for students. maybe we would exit the student from the intervention, but the other option would be to increase the goal. Another thing that could happen is that the trend line is even with the goal line, in which we could assume that what we're doing is working and we would continue as we were going. But we'd still want to continue to collect data, and after about 4 to 6 data points, take another look and make sure that we really are continuing along with the goal line. And then the final decision would be if the trend line is flatter than the goal line, that would suggest that the student is not making sufficient progress, and that's where we would decide to change instruction. Next slide, please. So in Molly's case, it's pretty clear here that her trend line is below the goal line, and so that would indicate to us that we really ought to make an instructional change. Next slide, please. So in order to make that instructional change, the teacher would generate some hypotheses about why the student, in this case Molly, is not making sufficient progress. Next slide, please. To make that hypothesis, we give teachers some guidance, which we provide through a rubric, and that rubric will be included in the materials that we mention at the end. But this kind of walks the teacher through some self-check questions. So I know my student isn't making progress. I probably need to make a change. What's the first thing I should think about? So that first question is, how was the intervention chosen, and was it delivered as intended? So we encourage teachers to think about, was I using a research-based intervention that has evidence of efficacy for kids like Molly? Have I implemented that with fidelity, the way it was designed? If either of those questions has the answer no, then the first step would be to correct the intervention, either to make sure that, if possible, it's a research-based intervention that's matched well to that student, but also, very importantly, that it's being implemented with fidelity. And I've worked with teachers who say, you know what, I didn't do it with fidelity. I really need to go back and correct that piece before I start assuming that the intervention isn't working. Next, please. So, but if the answers to those first two questions are yes, then the teacher might need to think a little bit more deeply about whether a change might be needed. And that change might be to setting, format, or delivery. It might be to content, or it might be to the focus of the intervention. And I'll talk about each of those pieces in more detail. Next slide, please. So if we think that the student needs a change to setting, format, or delivery, we provide some guidance for teachers to think through what kinds of changes might be needed. Does the student need more time? Does the student need some sort of motivational component, more one-on-one interaction, or maybe a smaller group? Or is it more the delivery? Does the student need more opportunities to respond and to practice, more explicit or systematic instruction? And from there, the teacher can sort of brainstorm ways that they might address those different types of problems, depending on what they've noticed the student struggling with. Next slide, please. Alternatively, the teacher might hypothesize that the student needs a change to the content. So maybe the setting, the format, and delivery are fine, but the teacher realizes that I'm really not working on the right content, maybe not working on the right words if we're working on spelling, or the right letters if we're working on handwriting. So that's where maybe going back to the scope and sequence if you're working from a particular curriculum or program, and seeing which aspects has the student mastered, and which pieces of content does the student actually still need to work on, and making an adjustment there. Next slide, please. Or the teacher might hypothesize that the student needs a change in focus. Maybe I've been working on text generation when really the student needs some support in transcription in order to be able to get their great ideas down onto paper. So taking a step back and saying, am I even working in the right area or areas of the simple view of writing? And for our teachers, again, we give some guidance in terms of both those diagnostic checklists, which you see on the left 2 columns in this little chart here, and the interventions that might match those. So really thinking through what are the strengths and weaknesses of the student, and how does that align with specific interventions that have a research base and are available. Next slide, please. So Mr. O'Reilly, after kind of thinking through all of these things, comes up with 3 hypotheses, all related to the setting and format of instruction, because he believes that the content and focus is matched well to Molly's needs, but he has a sense that maybe she's not motivated, maybe her group is too large, or maybe she just needs more time. Now, Molly usually is pretty motivated and doesn't think that's really the issue. He can't do much about the group size. That's just the schedule that he has. So he picks the hypothesis that Molly needs more time in her current intervention. Next slide, please. So then he'll make a change based on that hypothesis by adding some instructional time, maybe going from 3 times per week to 5 times per week, or adding an extra 5 or 10 minutes on at the end. And then he continues to collect data under that new intervention, intervention 2. And you'll notice that he did not throw out his writing instructional program and start with a whole new curriculum or a whole new set of materials. He really made a minor change. But the idea with data-based instruction is that you make systematically one change at a time to really try to figure out what is it that's going to work for this student. Next slide, please. And usually it does take time to find that right intervention. And you can see with Molly's progress over time here that she does kind of increase her level of performance, but often her trend line is going in the wrong direction. So it takes a few different hypotheses and attempts at instruction before Mr. O'Reilly finally hits on the thing that's actually going to work for Molly. And you can see by the end that there's a happy ending, that Molly does actually reach and even exceed her goal. But I should emphasize that this process takes a lot of persistence and relentlessness on the part of the teacher, that it's not easy, and it does take time to eventually find the thing that's going to work for a student. But with data, the teacher will know when certain ideas or hypotheses are bearing out in actual progress for the student. Next slide. Now, we do have some results from our project, which we included in case we have time. I do want to make sure that we have time for questions, so we might just kind of breeze through the next few slides, and I can kind of touch on what they're talking about, but you should have the handout, and you're welcome to peruse the data in more depth as you have time and interest to do so. We could go to the next slide. What we're sharing here are findings from a pilot study that Erica and I and our research teams conducted a couple of years ago, and which serve as the basis for the new efficacy project that Erica mentioned, where we'll be doing a much larger scale evaluation of DBI and writing. But basically, we worked with teachers in our 2 states, Minnesota and Missouri, and we had 23 special ed teachers and 56 children that they worked with in grades 1 through 5 who had various disabilities that affected their writing skills. And teachers were assigned randomly to either receive DBI TLC, and I'll explain what that is, or business as usual control. Next slide, please. So our teachers, once they were assigned to either the intervention or the control, they went through the whole school year. We did pre and post testing, and the teachers in the DBI TLC group received tools, which is the T, learning in the form of workshops, which is the L, and then collaborative support in the form of coaching, which we provided to support teachers' use of DBI over the course of the study. Next slide, please. And we collected some data both about the feasibility of DBI and the promise of DBI. So in terms of feasibility, we asked teachers to keep track of how long it took per child per week to do the different DBI activities. And so you can see in this graph that over time, the preparing materials for CBM and intervention kind of took a long time at the beginning, but for the most part across the school year ended up taking no more than 10 minutes per week per child on average. That's with the exception of probably right after the holidays, teachers were taking some time preparing some new intervention materials. So you can see that that aspect of DBI became fairly non-time consuming over time. Next slide, please. We see a similar pattern with implementing CBM, which includes administering, scoring, and graphing. Next slide, please. But a lot of variability in terms of looking at data and developing hypotheses, which we would expect teachers to take time to do in order to make good instructional decisions for their students. Next slide, please. And finally, delivering intervention, receiving coaching, and the total time implemented. You can see here, again, there's a lot of variability, but for the most part, this is where teachers were spending their most time. They weren't doing a lot of time with administering CBM and looking at graphs. They were spending most of their time in instruction, which is really what we would hope to see. Next slide, please. We also saw that teachers in our DBI TLC group made great gains in terms of their knowledge and skills, and those gains were statistically significantly different and much larger than teachers in the control group. Next slide, please. And on word dictation, we saw that students in the DBI group generally outperformed controls on various scoring procedures, including correct letter sequences, which is shown here. Next slide, please. And a similar pattern, although not statistically significant, on our picture word measure, and also our story prompt on the next slide. So we saw promising patterns in terms of student outcomes. We saw strong patterns of improvement in terms of teacher knowledge and skills, and also some of the other outcomes that we measured in our teachers. And so we're using this information to move forward and do some larger scale examination of the effectiveness of DBI for teachers when they get tools, learning, and collaborative support. Next slide, please. So that was a pretty quick overview of those findings. Again, you're welcome to take a look in more detail on the slides that we provided. I did want to mention that if you are interested in the actual materials that we've referred to throughout our webinar today, the assessment tools, which include CBM measures, the scoring guidelines, and the videos that Erica mentioned, those are available on our websites. The videos are, and then the materials can be obtained through the first website that's listed here, arc.missouri.edu. We actually have 2 manuals put together that are available for purchase, and that includes the assessments, the instructional materials. We have mini lessons that align with a simple view of writing, and we have database decision-making tools that help teachers go through that process of developing hypotheses and making instructional changes when the data indicate that students do need a change. And I think I will stop there and see if there are questions. Great. We do have a couple questions that have come in throughout the time, so I'll just share some of those. So, Kristen, you were just talking about kind of some places to find the word and sentence measures that you guys were talking about. Do you have other ideas or suggestions of places where you can access materials that you guys talked about within CBM for writing? Is that a good place to start for folks for either free access or for purchase if they're looking for materials on writing prompts, word and sentence measure prompts for CBM? Yeah, so definitely checking out the resource that we gave. Those will include all 3 of the different types of measures that Erica talked about. So we have word dictation, picture word, and the story prompts. And for each of those, there are 20 different forms. So they can be used for progress monitoring. There are other folks who are developing early writing measures. So Kristen Ritchie and David Coker have also been doing some work with early writing measures and extending down to kindergarten as well. So their work would be great to take a look at. But as far as places to access writing measures, I don't know that there are a lot of the places where you might go, like Ames Web. They have the story prompts, but the early writing measures are fairly new, and I don't know of particular resources beyond what we've shared so far. Erica, I don't know if you have.
No, agreed.
Okay, great, thank you. And so just in thinking about kind of the grade span for the early writing prompts, you just talked about a little bit, Kristen, that some were going down to starting to go down to kindergarten. Kind of where are you thinking with the grade span for the early writing prompts that you guys were talking about within the work that you guys did in the DBI project and some of that work?
Go ahead, Kristen.
Okay, sorry. We've collected data on our measures for kids in grades 1 through 3. So we actually have psychometric information like reliability and criterion validity, and we've developed some benchmarks for kids in grades 1 through 3. Sometimes teachers choose to use measures with older students who might need extra writing support, and certainly the story prompts, there's research that's been done even up through high school for those students. But the word dictation and picture word prompts, we have empirical data for grades 1 through 3, so that's where I would feel most confident recommending their use. Great. All right, and then a question about kind of thinking about CBM best practices. When you're taking kind of progress monitoring data over time, if a student is absent from kind of the weekly or biweekly progress monitoring session that you are planning to take, is it best to just kind of skip that session and continue on your kind of regular trajectory of progress monitoring, to do it after a certain number of intervention sessions? Kind of what is the best practice when the student might not be there when you had planned to provide the progress monitoring measure?
I think I'll just jump in real quick. I mean, I think that Kristen and I would both say that if at all possible, you need to try to administer the measure to the student as soon as he or she gets back to school. So we really want to try to be consistent about data collection. And so even if the student's gone for a couple of days and you can catch them when they come back, I would say the only time that you might skip one is if the point when they come back to school is really close then to the next time you're going to progress monitor, like it's like the next day or something. You don't want to give measures that close together. But generally, I think our advice would be just try to catch up and give it when the student gets back.
Great. All right. And we had a question about kind of thinking about the 3 types of assessments you guys talked about. How do you know which one of those assessments to start with, or how do you think about that when you're working with students, whether it's the picture word or the story prompt or the dictation one?
Yeah, I think, we have some guidance about that in our materials, and we kind of help teachers talk through that. But I think in a very kind of straightforward manner, you could think about that simple review of writing that I talked about. If your student is at the transcription level, you're going to want to choose from either the word dictation or the picture word prompt. I'll be honest, a lot of the teachers that we're working with who have kids who have really intense writing needs, they're likely starting with word dictation or with picture word prompts. If you have a student who's writing kind of at the sentence level, maybe they need a little, you feel like they're kind of ready to move on to that text generation level, then you could pick picture word or story prompts.
Great. And then, Kristen, you mentioned, I think, earlier when you were talking about kind of the grade spans that you were really looking at kind of that first to third grade. But would this work okay for students who are behind an instructional level for kind of at the instructional level of a first or second grade student, but maybe in middle school? And if so, kind of how do you think about kind of what program or research-based program or instructional program to use with a student like that? I know it might be difficult to think about kind of a specific student, but kind of thinking about that frame, is it okay to kind of think about the student's instructional level if they might be a middle school student or a slightly older student in this approach?
I do. So in the pilot study that we did that I talked about briefly, we did have some students who were in 4th and 5th grade, not as high as middle school, but in that case, teachers did decide that because of the level of skill of those students, the DBI materials that we provided were appropriate. I would reiterate that the story prompt is the measure that does have more evidence for use with older students, and so if students are writing at the passage level, they're able to produce passage level text. I would choose that as the writing measure just because of the empirical support that it has, but I don't think I would discourage teachers from using the other measures if students aren't able to produce writing at that level. And then as far as instructional materials go, and I know that in a couple of weeks Steve Graham will be talking much more about instruction, but I think the intervention materials could be appropriate. I mean, they're explicit instruction in the different types of skills that align with a simple view, and some of the materials that we recommend are actually the SRSD that Erica mentioned, self-regulated strategy development, that have been very extensively researched with kids across elementary, middle, and high school, and have a lot of strong evidence for kids who are at the text generation and self-regulation point of, or have needs in those areas. So, so I do think a lot of this could be applicable, and I think if you're collecting data and looking at it, it can show whether students are responding to those instructional approaches.
Question that had come in prior to the webinar was a little bit around kind of how do you think about, and I think you alluded to kind of how the time to do some of this work changed over the course of the project when you were working with teachers and they got more efficient over time. Were there any specific strategies or tips or techniques, or was it more just getting comfortable with the approach or process? Any ideas for how to make this a slightly more efficient or effective process for when people have really busy schedules as they're thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the great thing about this project. We got a ton of feedback from participating teachers along the way about how to manage this practically, and the feasibility piece was critically important to us, because if it's not feasible for teachers to implement, they're not going to do it. And so we did see examples of teachers who were doing things like preparing materials in advance. So they would have the materials they need for progress monitoring set up in either a 3-ring binder or folders for the students, so they could quickly pull those out. You know, they, in some cases, print, you know, all of the measures that they needed for the year, you know, and have those already in the folder so that they could quickly pull those out. Trying to think of other things. I think also graphing is a big piece of this, and so having the graph quickly accessible on, you know, the teacher's desktop, you know, if the teacher's working in Excel, so that they could quickly pop that open and put the score in for that particular day. Those are just a couple of quick examples that come to mind.
Another thing that we really emphasized was the importance of making this part of the instructional routine. So having a specific time where you always not only administer the CBM measures and do the intervention, but also having a regular time for entering data and looking at it, because those are the pieces that often kind of pile up, like, oh, I'll score that later, I'll enter that data later. But those are the things that don't get done if you don't have a really specific routine that really just becomes habit. So we did spend time with our teachers trying to figure out ways where they could sort of develop that habit and just make it part of their daily life.
Great, thanks so much. I'm trying to think. It looks like we're a little after 4, so I'll just wrap up with kind of one last question, and this one's a little bit of a meaty one as well. And so again, just feel free to touch on kind of any ways that you guys were thinking about this within your project. But I think that one of the challenges always is kind of balancing the demands within an MTSS framework on writing or math or reading or other kind of areas. How did the sites that you are working with kind of balance kind of the focus on writing instruction within this piece? And kind of how do you think about kind of, without digging into too much of the instructional time, being able to balance the time needed for kind of instruction and writing and this DBI process for writing?
Well, I think that that most of the teachers that we were working with they actually had writing time set aside. So a lot of these students were students that were being pulled out for writing already. And so it's just that the time that was being spent on writing wasn't very efficient, or the instruction wasn't very intense. And so it felt like there wasn't a lot accomplished. Sometimes, maybe there was only 20 minutes for writing, but there just wasn't very much accomplished during that time. A lot of kind of open sort of free writing. So I think our materials help teachers kind of intensify that time. If you're using this in an RTI approach, I think the way that we've seen in a couple of our schools, teachers have taken this and used it, for instance, in a Tier 3 pull-out intervention group. I think the question is alluding to, how do I balance, instruction for a student who needs intervention time in reading, math, writing. And so you have to think about the data that you have that supports a particular student's needs, and also the additional support the student's getting during the day. Like if the student's already getting a couple different doses of reading support during the day, you may feel like it's worth it to spend that RTI Tier 3 intervention time on writing. So Kristen, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
One other thing kind of goes along with what you were saying is that we should remember that learning to write really supports learning to read and vice versa. And if you do get a chance to take a look at some of the intervention materials, I think you'll see that there is kind of a complement, especially between maybe beginning reading skills and some of the spelling activities where kids are having to use phonological awareness and letter sound recognition to spell as well as to read words. So there is a really strong connection there, and maybe not always thinking of them as separate things will actually be really beneficial to students.
And then one last question that came in that I think is a good one was around kind of goal setting and where you got your goal setting. And I think you alluded to a little bit earlier, Kristen, that you guys have normed some of the tools that you are using, right? So just talk a little bit more to kind of how did teachers set goals in the process for those students using the different prompts?
Yeah, so we did collect 2 years worth of data, 1 year in Missouri and 1 in Minnesota for grades 1, 2, and 3 so that we could get, and we did it fall, winter, and spring in our 2 states with typically developing students. And so we do have some preliminary benchmarks, and actually looking across Minnesota and Missouri, the mean level of performance on the various scoring procedures was generally quite similar. And so we feel fairly comfortable at least using those data in a sort of informal way for goal setting, certainly. We also were able to generate some rates of improvement. So if teachers prefer to use kind of what a typical rate of improvement would be to set goals, they could do that as well. The manuals that we provide do have a few different options. So one is using sort of that normative benchmark type data, whether it's local or because you could even collect data within a school to find out what kids in that school are performing at, or you could use benchmark data like the stuff that we've generated. We do also have a more individualized approach where the teacher would actually collect several weeks of data and generate a slope for the student, so a rate of improvement for that individual student, and then actually take that rate of improvement and multiply it by, we usually say 1.5, so that you're increasing the expected rate of improvement, but not by too much, and use that as a more individualized approach. It's a little hard maybe to understand when I just explain it, but you have some guidance around that. But very similar to how you would set a goal for reading or math, where you're either using benchmark data, rates of improvement, or a more individualized approach.
Great, thank you so much. And Nick, can you just flip on to the next slide as I wrap up? So we just wanted to plug, I think Kristen and Erica both mentioned, but we have one other webinar in this series really digging into writing instruction a little bit deeper with Dr. Steve Graham, and that's going to be on October 26th from 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon as well. And so that will provide a little bit more time to really get into the instructional practices and thinking about instructional practices for writing. So we're really looking forward to that and hope folks can rejoin us for that webinar. And just like this one, we will post the archive of it. So if you have a conflict on the 26th and you're not able to attend, we will definitely post that so that you can access that information and that material. And the last couple of slides here, Nick, if you just want to scroll through, just show some ways to connect both with NCII and then on the next slide with CEC's Division of Research to dig in a little bit more if you want to join our newsletter if you're not or already a member, or want to follow us on social media or stay up to date with anything, as well as a screenshot of our webinar. And then on the next slide, Nick, there should be some material here about CEC's Division of Research so you can see more about some of the work that they are doing and stay up to date with some of the work that group is doing and their Twitter handle and Facebook and so on. So stay connected with us. And we really appreciate you guys taking the time and holding on a little extra with some great questions. So thank you again for a wonderful webinar. Both Kristen and Erica, we really appreciate it and hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.